Moving to the human aspect of cybersecurity, I'm delighted to be joined by our panel to discuss towards a safer cyberspace. We have Jeremy Epstein, who's the lead program director of Secure and Trustworthy Cyberspace at the US National Science Foundation. We've Dr. Mary Aiken, Ph.D. She's a professor of forensic cyber psychology at University of East London, and it's moderated by our colleague Robert Mauro Bob from the Boston College. So I'll hand over to that panel. Just to say to the audience, we're probably running about 10 minutes behind, so please do bear with us. We'll try to make up some of the time, but please stay on. This is a fascinating discussion that you'll hear and see, and we will take time for just one question at the end of it. So hand over to you, Bob, in conversation.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the next panel, Beyond Cybersecurity Towards a Safer Cyberspace. We're joined by Dr. Mary Aiken and Jeremy Epstein. Dr. Aiken is a professor of forensic cyber psychology at the University of East London. She's an adjunct professor at the University College Dublin, an academic advisor at Europol's European Cybersecurity Center, a member of Interpol's Global Cybercrime Expert Group, and author of the acclaimed book, The Cyber Effect. Jeremy Epstein is lead program director for Secure and Trustworthy Cyberspace at the US National Science Foundation. This is the flagship NSF multidisciplinary cybersecurity and privacy program. Prior to joining NSF, Jeremy was at DARPA, where he headed a project on secure and trustworthy cyberspace. He's also vice chair of the Association for Computing Machinery and U.S. Technology Policy Committee, where he founded a scholarship for women in information security. And Jeremy has a passion for election and voting security, both issues we will turn to in just a moment. I think we'll start first with Dr. Aiken. Mary, can you talk to us a little bit about what cyber psychology is and how it relates to cybersecurity?
So cyber psychology is the study of the impact of technology on human behavior. My specialist area is forensic cyber psychology, which is the study of criminal, deviant, and abnormal behavior online. And unfortunately, in this day and age, I'm kept pretty busy. It's an advanced discipline within applied psychology, about 20 years in existence now, and it really brings together technology and psychology in terms of explanatory value. So yeah, that's cyber psychology.
And what do you do as a cyber psychologist when it comes to cybersecurity? We've been talking, obviously, in the run up to this about something called safety tech. Is sort of where this space meets. And so maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what safety tech is and what impact it has for the cybersecurity field.
Yeah, so the first thing in terms of cyber psychology, we argue that human behavior changes or mutates in cyber context. There's an amplification and escalation often. And we also hypothesize cyberspace as being a powerful psychological environment. So in 2016, NATO ratified cyberspace as a domain, acknowledging that the battles of the future would take place on land, sea, and air, and on computer networks. So we now have to start thinking about cyberspace as an environment. And what we can do is we can go back to the work of Prochansky, a great environmental psychologist, and consider the impact of environment on human behavior. So people are growing up in cyberspace. The behavior is changing. It changes for criminal population, it changes for sophisticated threat actors, it changes for activists and hacktivists, but it also changes for general population. To date, we've had huge investment in cybersecurity, but cybersecurity focuses on protecting data, information, networks, and systems. It does not focus on protecting what it is to be human online. And we've seen this new evolution, and I work closely with the UK government in this area, where we have this emerging, very exciting sector described as the online safety technology sector, or safety tech. And what's the difference between safety tech and cybersecurity? It's that difference of focusing on humans online. And we want our networks and systems to be robust, resilient, and secure. But we also want the people who use and operate those systems to be psychologically robust, resilient, and secure. We're conducting research at the moment into the US safety tech sector. And the good news is we're seeing evidence of an emerging and thriving sector. So safety tech will offer technology solutions to technology facilitated problem behaviors, ranging from cyberbullying through to online harassment, through to mis and disinformation online. And I'll just wrap up by saying that it's very hard often to explain these abstract constructs of, well, what does mis and disinformation online mean? Or what are the consequences of mis and disinformation? Does it matter? Well, it matters because there's a symbiotic relationship between the real world and cyberspace. And the recent events of Capitol Hill are an absolute example of what happens when online harm, mis and disinformation, builds online and then spills over into the real world with tragic consequences.
Thanks, Mary. We'll come back to some of that. I think people will be really interested to hear about the relationship between the online and the digital and the analog world. But Jeremy, Mary highlighted during her remarks there that there's evidence that there's a growing safety tech industry in the US. What role does NSF have to play in this emerging field, or does it have a role to play?
Thank you for the opportunity to join you. And I need to start out by saying my opinions are my opinions and don't necessarily reflect those of the US government, the usual disclaimer. NSF's role and the Secure and Trustworthy Cyberspace program that I lead, or SATC as we call it, is a very broad program. And I view it actually somewhat differently, slightly differently than Mary, that we view cybersecurity as including all the things she talked about. We don't view those as separate. We call our program cyber technical as the space. And so we view that all of these topic areas are in fact legitimate areas for cybersecurity research. Our funding comes from both our computer science area and also our social sciences area. We have we fund hundreds of projects that are socio-technical in nature, including many of the topics that Mary suggested. I think that's one difference perhaps between our program in the US and programs in some other countries. On the positive side, though, we're seeing a lot more international interest in it. We have a joint program in cybersecurity research between the National Science Foundation, Science Foundation Ireland, SFI, and the Department for the Economy, DFE, in Northern Ireland, where we're encouraging researchers to come together from all three jurisdictions to submit joint proposals to the three agencies, which then fund them jointly. So I agree very much with Mary. These are crucial areas that we can't look at cybersecurity as just a technical area the way we did maybe 10 or 20 years ago, that it encompasses all these areas: cyberbullying, disinformation, et cetera. Some of the other issues I'm less familiar with, but we view that any solution needs to address all of these different, the human aspects as well as the technical aspects.
What kind of, I mean, you just talked about bringing researchers to get together across a multidisciplinary space, but what kinds of things can NSF do to encourage psychologists, social scientists of different kinds, political scientists, sociologists, to work with those in the tech fields like computer science?
So I started a program within NSF, within the SATC program, about 7 or 8 years ago, where we encouraged social scientists and computer scientists who had not previously worked together to submit joint research proposals on new topic areas. And we ended up through that, I think, somewhere around 100 research projects we started up with seed funding, with psychologists, sociologists, criminologists, gerontologists, et cetera, every kind of ologist you can think about from the social sciences. And they cover a wide gamut of topics, like how do people react to hooking up to an open Wi-Fi hotspot in a bad neighborhood as opposed to a good neighborhood. That might seem pretty trivial, but it affects how people view security. What sort of nudges can we give people to recognize the risk of putting things in their phone, and how do they react if they're in an area where they feel safe or unsafe? So we definitely encourage these sorts of joint research programs, and we've held a number of workshops to bring together people from these different disciplines.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Now, Mary, as a researcher, and you just released a report, or you co-authored a report on the UK's safety tech industry. I mean, what are some of the successful policy initiatives that governments have brought in to help bring communities together, communities of researchers together to address these topics? Jeremy's been talking about what NSF is doing. I mean, where do you see the direction in the UK and Europe in these similar areas?
I think that the most important piece of legislation that is going through the system at the moment in the UK is the online harms bill, because in terms of defining the problem space, for the first time, it looks at creating this spectrum of online harm in terms of the connectivity between these various problem behaviors. And at an EU level, we're also seeing legislation in and around the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which is really about protecting minors online in terms of the sort of online content that they're engaging with. And that has to do with age verification and the concept of online harms. We have a report coming out in 2 weeks' time for Ofcom, who will be the regulator of the online video services online, so Instagram, TikTok, etc. And the regulation will attempt to protect young people from online harms, specifically in terms of video sharing platforms. But to protect people from harm, you have to define, well, what is the harm? And that's where it gets a little more complicated. So in our research, we did a large literature review. And rather than creating a taxonomy of harm, we created a taxonomy of risk of harm. What are the sort of risks that are prevalent? And then we also introduced the safety tech taxonomy to create a sort of framework of benefits, risk of harm, social solutions, which is education awareness, raising, etc., more of the same of what we've all been doing for 20 years. And then factoring in safety tech solutions that deploy at a platform level, at a system level, at an endpoint level, and in the information environment. So it's really connecting technology solutions with legislative efforts. We'll be looking at the same thing in the US. And I agree with Jeremy in terms of, we've had HCI for years in this space in terms of trying to factor in humans in a cyber context. But this is not about the speed of how fast your screen scrolls or how big your thumbs are in terms of human-computer interaction. This is about the profound and pervasive impact of technology on humans at a psychological level in terms of the individual and a sociological level in terms of the group. And this new focus on safety tech is evidenced by the number of bills and hearings going through the US, being proposed in the US at the moment. I'll just list some of them. You've got the PACT Act and Section 230, which is actually looking at specifically at disseminating speech online and implications in and around 230. You have emerging trends in online foreign influence operations, social media, COVID-19, and election security. Another act, you have a country in crisis, how disinformation online is dividing the nation. So these are a series of hearings and bills that are being proposed. You have the Countering Online Harms Act, May 19, 2020, which will require the Federal Trade Commission to study and report how AI may be used to identify, remove, take action to address online harms, content furthering other illegal activities such as the sale of opioids, child sexual exploitation, terrorism, and the sale of counterfeit products. You also have the Earn It Act, holding the tech industry accountable for the fight against online child sexual exploitation, March 2020. You have the Americans at Risk, Manipulation and Deception in the Digital Age Act, January 2020. And very recently, Senator Mark Warner et al. Announced the Safeguarding Against Fraud, Exploitation, Threats, Extremism, and Consumer Harms, the Safe Tech Act, which will aim to reform Section 230 and allow social media companies to be held accountable for enabling cyberstalking, target harassment, and discrimination on their platforms. So I would argue that there is certainly a major wave at the moment in the US in terms of focusing on online safety, focusing on online harms, that is something very distinct from the cybersecurity practices to date.
And Mary, you already raised this issue in your previous comments, but you talked a little bit about that relationship between what is happening online and what happens to individuals and groups of individuals, and you raised the January 6th insurrection at Congress. I mean, like, could you tell us what is at stake here ultimately? I mean, you already talked.
Democracy. We are sleepwalking our way into this age of technology. We adopt each emerging technology with the collective wisdom of lemmings leaping off a cliff. Just because it's new doesn't mean it's good. Technology will only mean progress when we can mitigate harmful effects. And to mitigate those effects, we have to understand them. We have to understand this complex architecture. We have to understand why human behavior changes. We have to understand what happens when populations syndicate online. So let me give you an example. And I write about this in my book, The Cyber Effect, a theoretical construct that I describe as as online syndication. So it's really the mathematics of criminal, deviant, and abnormal behavior. So in a real world context, the incidence of these behaviors was bound or capped by the laws of proximity and domain. What does that mean? You're a sex offender in the north of the country, I'm a sex offender in the south of the country. What was the chances of us coming together to normalize and socialize our deviant interests? It was capped. And also, it would present great risk to ourselves to state that preference. But now, under the cover of anonymity and fueled by online disinhibition, these populations can come together to normalize and socialize their belief systems. So whether you're a 13-year-old girl with an eating disorder who finds a pro-Anna website, or whether you're somebody who believes the election was stolen and now you surround yourself with a whole cohort that reinforce that belief system, the same thing is happening. And what we have to factor in is, well, what is the impact on society? Professor Tim Wu writes about the attention economy, about monetizing our attention, and the algorithms that underlie that monetization effect pull towards the extreme. And that's how you keep somebody's attention. So if you start watching, cop car chases on YouTube, eventually you get hauled towards something very extreme. These weapons of mass distraction are designed to hold our attention and pull us to the extreme. And we all talk about filter bubbles and getting caught up. If you get caught up in a filter bubble because you like to work out, you end up getting Nike trainers or protein powders or gym memberships, hurled at you. The worst thing that is going to happen is that you're going to become more fit. But what happens when you get caught in a distorted filter bubble and those belief systems are normalized and socialized, and then that explodes back into the real world? So this is what I'm interested in focusing on, is explaining these behaviors, understanding these behaviors, understanding the impact, and understanding the impact for society. And when we talk about anonymity online, and Jeremy, I know that when we chatted before, the importance of privacy and the importance of how we sort of legislate in this space, and how the integrity of our data and our online identities. But when you argue about anonymity, people argue that it's a basic human right. It is not a basic human right. It is an invention of the internet, and we have to have that conversation about the greater good. Yes, we want anonymity in some contexts, in some, oppressed regime where somebody wants to tweet or vlog or blog, but at what cost? And if the cost is child sexual abuse and exploitation, if the cost is rampant cybercriminality, if the cost is cyber attacks or threats, or then we need as a society to have that conversation. And when you talk about privacy and collective security and the vitality of the tech industry, none of those aims should have primacy over the other. And personally, I make no apology for being pro social order in the real world and in cyberspace. But I really worry about how we can deliver on collective security when increasingly you see encrypted domains that are effectively beyond the rule of law.
Thanks, Mary. Jeremy, Mary's been talking about filter bubbles and the importance of the existential threat they present to both our society and to individuals. And she then raised this prospect about the trade-offs between privacy, anonymity, and a public good. I mean, in your role at NSF, when you are thinking about these issues, how do you make decisions, or is it up to you to make decisions about this in the way you encourage research calls and encourage academics to work together?
Well, certainly we have the ability to influence the direction things go, because like it or not, it's our responsibility to allocate public taxpayer money into research, and there isn't enough money to cover everything. So our decisions do de facto influence those things. We try, of course, to the NSF model, as is the case in many funding agencies, is to use peer review panels to ensure we're getting lots of good opinions. But we bring our own opinions as well. The people who work as program officers are experts in the field, and we try to have many people look at everything to get lots of opinions. One of the things that I want to focus on in a little bit is the interaction between privacy and some of the topics that Mary mentioned. As she said, one of my concerns with automating many of the technologies, the techniques that we need to do to address these problems at scale can themselves introduce privacy issues, introduce bias issues. It's always been the case that, for example, there's been bias in hiring, that it's been harder for women and people of color to get jobs. But now we have these AI systems, as was famously revealed a few years ago by Amazon, where something that was supposedly impartial, in fact, made things worse, much worse, because it said, these are the sorts of people we've hired in the past, and let's find more people who look like them. And it turns out not just look like them intellectually, but look like them physically. And so it provided, because as an example, the typical Amazon a technology worker had not come from a historically Black college or university, was not a female, was not a Hispanic, et cetera, it picked more people like them that didn't have those characteristics that we in fact want to increase diversity. And my concern is, as if we try to automate some of these other technologies to, for example, stop cyberbullying by mapping out using artificial intelligence, this is what cyberbullying looks like. Do we have confidence that it will, in fact, stop cyberbullying and it won't accidentally stop other desirable things or discriminate by identifying language used in some communities that might be different from the language used in the dominant culture and result in falsely identifying some discussions as cyberbullying when they're not. It's just a difference in cultural use of language. So these are the sorts of things that we have to balance, is not just what is cyberbullying, but what are the social impacts and how does AI make things worse or better or both. It's not always going to be obvious what the answer is. The people who write these AI systems, in vast majorities, they are not trying to discriminate. But when you train these systems using real data that is, in fact, biased, you get biased results. It's sort of a garbage in, garbage out scenario, except nobody knows whether the input is, in fact, garbage. So these are some of the challenges we have to do, and these are things we'll be funding at NSF, is looking at some of these challenges to make sure we're getting different angles on the problem.
That's really interesting. On some of these kind of innovative challenges, the challenges around the data, and you're contemplating them at NSF, in your relationship with industry and those people who are behind, funding industry, the investors and the venture capital community, I mean, are they alive to these challenges, or is it up to you to sort of convey that message as the safety tech industry grows in the US?
So we have worked at NSF with people from industry. We did a joint program with Amazon a few years ago to fund research in artificial intelligence and ethics. And there was a lot of controversy about that because people thought that Amazon was going to be passing judgment on what ethics research got funded. And in fact, they weren't, but there was a lot of press about that was inaccurate. So we definitely work with industry. We're starting a brand new program. We just announced it about a month ago called Designing Accountable Software Systems, where we're encouraging people to look at how do we build software systems that we ensure are doing what we want them to do and that are compliant with legislation and regulation. People may not realize that even when there's laws, a lot of times the computer systems we have don't enforce them. There was a case, since my interest is in voting and security, there was a case a number of years ago, I think about 10 years ago, where it turned out that in New York State, there was a law that said you could have what's called ranked choice voting, where you could pick the preference order, not just one candidate, but you could say, this is my preference order. And then this got implemented in software to choose who won the race. It turned out the software didn't implement the same algorithm as described in the law. And it shouldn't happen, but software is one kind of artifact and law is a different kind of artifact. And the people who build these are not the same. The lawyers may not understand what's possible in software, and the software developers may not understand the subtleties of the law. And yet somehow we have to build systems that bring these things together. And that's going to be a lot more complex. And many of the issues that Mary raises, if we have laws and regulations that require that we act in certain ways, we still have to figure out how to tell the programmers how to actually implement these in ways that are consistent with what the law intends, so that we get the results we think we're going to get, instead of something that's close but not quite the same as what was intended.
Okay.
I think Bob, just a fascinating point that Jeremy has flagged up there, because I think it shows the need for a transdisciplinary approach. So we have computer scientists, we have cyber psychologists, but we need criminologists as well working together. And I think the point about online harms and these criminal, deviant, or abnormal behaviors online is they increasingly have the characteristics of big data in terms of volume and velocity and variety. And therefore, we're going to need AI and ML solutions to actually tackle them, but also to prosecute, to gather the evidence. And I think the real breakthroughs will come when we can write an algorithm that actually defines cyberbullying, as a mathematical equation: content by direction, by interval, by frequency equals, our harassment. And then deploy that, but then you get into surveillance issues, and infringement of privacy. But so it's this constant sort of very interesting discussion that we need to have, because the law enforcement are swamped. They're absolutely swamped. I'm writing a paper for Europol at the moment, and it's titled "The Cyber Blue Line," and it's based on the thin red line, a stretched resource meeting irresistible force. That's what's happening in cyberspace. And we need to have these conversations to work towards constructing solutions.
That's really fascinating. We have about a minute left, and I just want to close on one final question. We've been talking a lot about how to bring academia, industry, the funding agencies together, and it sounds like there is agreement right now, or there is some agreement at least, on what some of the challenges are and where some of the pinch points are. I mean, how do we ensure that that conversation about the emerging threats and challenges continues in a way that keeps pace with those emerging threats? I'm not sure if you guys have given too much thought to this. We only have about a minute left, so there's not much time to cover it. But Mary, maybe you could start.
I think that we need accessible funding, and we need rapid research. The traditional scientific process in terms of applying for grants, being awarded the grant, collecting the data, peer review, publishing, there is a possibility, if not a probability, that the phenomenon under study is already passed by the time we have research to inform the process. So for me, the solution lies in rapid research and accessible funding to actually provide evidence-based solutions to some of these challenges.
And Jeremy, how do you ensure that NSF is keeping a pace?
I love what Mary said, because we have a program we call RAPID at NSF, which is designed for exactly this purpose. We fund projects. When the COVID pandemic began, within 2 weeks, we had a call out on the street saying, give us your best research in any topic within science, including cybersecurity and privacy and interdisciplinary areas, but certainly not limited to those. And we funded, within computer science alone, I think we funded 60 or 80 research projects relating to COVID. We got those started within 6 weeks of the beginning of the pandemic. We're seeing results. Some of the early stuff was some of the tracking, privacy protecting tracking technologies. We continue to do that. And we're always open to ideas in those areas. It doesn't have to be specifically when we have a call out, but we're always open to them. I'm about to fund one right now on looking at how people share pictures of people of other racial and ethnic groups, and what as memes, and what those mean in terms of discrimination and in terms of bias. So we're open to all sorts of new ideas like that, and I think that's really crucial. And it's also crucial that a lot of it be international. And so I'm very excited about our new program in cybersecurity writ large with the Republic of Ireland and with Northern Ireland.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Jeremy Epstein, Lead Program Director for Secure and Trustworthy Cyberspace at the U.S. National Science Foundation, and obviously very integrated into the ecosystem in Ireland and Northern Ireland. And of course, Dr. Mary Aiken, Professor of Forensic Cybersecurity at the University of East London and an adjunct professor at UCD, also equally plugged into what is happening in Ireland and Europe. Thank you for your insights today, and thank you for your time. I very much appreciate it.
Jeremy, Bob and Mary, thank you for a fascinating discussion. And Mary has had to leave us, but I do have Jeremy and Bob still with us. So thanks for that. I love the weapons of mass distraction. It's a fantastic comment. Bob, we're really tight for time, so I'm going to say thank you to Boston College. I'm going to say a big thank you to the US Embassy and to my own team here in Dublin BIC for pulling this event together. Fantastic event, some really great insights. Jeremy, I'm going to leave the last word to you and let me just frame it, if I may, for you. So we spent a lot of time thinking cybersecurity, it's a very significant issue. It touches, all dimensions of our society. And we're seeing that there's an astounding amount of analysis, understanding, investment, innovation are taking place to kind of build up a resilience and to kind of help us to prepare for it. My question to you to wrap us up for the event today, in terms of what you're seeing, in terms of the research that you're seeing, in terms of, and a lot of it is at an early stage, if we invited you to come back here in 3 or 4 years' time, what's the one big shift, if there is one, or there's a few, but what's the big shift that we'll see in a couple of years' time from your perspective, would you think?
Well, that's a small question to start or to finish up with. I think what we've seen over the past decade is that socio-technical aspects of computing and cybersecurity are increasingly recognized. You've got a computer in anything you have. I tried to write down, actually I gave a talk recently to a group of federal judges, and I came up with a list of 7 items, and I asked them, which of these things does not have a security risk, which of these things does not actually exist commercially and therefore doesn't have a security risk. And the only thing I could come up with that didn't actually exist commercially, that had with a cybersecurity risk, was a s'mores maker. If you're not familiar, this is an American dessert food that's eaten when camping. That was the only thing I could come up with that didn't have a computer in it. So we're going to see the ubiquity of computing, the ubiquity of cybersecurity risks, the socio-technical aspects. It's going to be a bigger problem. When I got into cybersecurity 30 years ago, my mother asked me, is there a future in that field? 30 years ago, it wasn't quite so clear. Now, I think it's very clear, and we all need to be focusing on security and privacy going forward.
Fantastic. Jeremy, thanks so much. I really appreciate the insights. And yeah, a big question to finish us off in a short time.